The school always felt different in the early morning, before the bell rang, before the hallways filled with noise, before judgment had an audience. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows lining the main corridor, stretching across the polished floor in long, pale shapes. The building smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old books, a sterile calm that existed only for a brief window of time each day. Lockers stood closed, untouched, like they were holding their breath. This was the hour when everything seemed possible, and when nothing bad had happened yet. She arrived early, like she always did, not because she had to, but because she liked the quiet, the way the world felt gentler when fewer people were watching. Her footsteps echoed softly as she walked, backpack resting neatly on one shoulder, posture straight, movements controlled. There was intention in how she carried herself, not rigid, not afraid, just careful. Careful had become second nature. She paused for a moment near the trophy case, glancing at her reflection in the glass. It wasn't vanity, it was a habit, a quick check, shirt tucked in, hair neat, expression neutral. No room for misunderstanding, no reason to be noticed. She had learned early that attention wasn't always a reward. To anyone else, she was just another student walking into another ordinary day, a quiet girl in a school uniform blending into the background of a place that didn't ask much of her, except compliance. But inside, her mind was already moving. She thought about the math test scheduled for later that morning, about the book she'd stayed up late reading, about her mother's reminder the night before to keep your head up and your voice steady, about the unspoken rules that never appeared in any handbook but were enforced all the same. Rules about tone, rules about posture, rules about knowing when to speak and when not to. She knew them well. The first bell hadn't rung yet, but a few teachers were already moving through the building, coffee cups in hand, conversations low and distracted. Their presence felt distant, almost abstract. Authority existed here in layers, some visible, some not. And at the top of that hierarchy sat the principal. Most students rarely thought about him unless they were in trouble. His office was tucked away at the end of a quiet hallway, far from the noise of classrooms and lunchrooms, a place you didn't visit unless something had already gone wrong. She'd passed that hallway countless times without ever needing to step inside, until today. But she didn't know that yet. Right now, the day still belonged to routine, to expectation, to the belief that if you followed the rules closely enough, you could move through unnoticed. She took her seat in the first classroom of the day, placing her notebook on the desk with deliberate care. The room filled slowly around her, chairs scraping softly, whispered conversations, the shuffle of papers, familiar faces, familiar energy. Normal. The teacher entered the class, greeted the class, and began the lesson. Numbers appeared on the board. Pens moved. The world narrowed to equations and quiet concentration. For a while, everything felt exactly as it should. And yet, there was something else. A tension so faint it barely registered. Not fear, not yet. More like a pressure in the air. The kind you feel before a storm, when the sky hasn't changed, but your body knows something is coming. She ignored it. She always did. Midway through the lesson, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just firm enough to interrupt. The teacher paused, glanced toward the hallway, then opened the door. A staff member stood there, posture formal, eyes scanning the room before settling on her. The pause stretched just a second too long. "Can you come with me?" the staff member said. No explanation, no tone of urgency, just a request that didn't feel optional. Every head turned. She felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, not panic, but awareness, the sensation of being seen when you didn't ask to be. She gathered her things slowly, movements controlled, and stood up. No questions, no protest. She'd learned better than that. As she stepped into the hallway, the classroom door closed behind her, sealing away the last fragment of normalcy. The quiet returned, heavier now. The staff member walked ahead, heels clicking softly against the floor, not looking back. They headed down the corridor, past classrooms, past bulletin boards decorated with motivational posters and smiling slogans about fairness and inclusion, words that always sounded better than they felt. She kept her eyes forward, mind racing but face composed. She replayed the last few days in her head, searching for mistakes, a missed assignment, a misunderstanding, something, anything that explained why she was being pulled out like this. Nothing came. The walk felt longer than it should have. The hallway narrowed, the light dimmed slightly, and then they stopped. The door at the end of the hall was closed, the principal's office. The staff member knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for a response. "He's ready to see you," they said. The room inside was quiet in a different way, thicker, more deliberate, the kind of quiet that belonged to power. The principal sat behind his desk, posture relaxed, expression unreadable. Papers were arranged neatly in front of him. Everything about the space felt intentional, controlled, orderly, unquestioned. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time that morning, the calm cracked. Not outwardly, in no visible way, but something in his gaze lingered, measured, assessing, like he had already decided who she was before she ever spoke. She stood where she was told to stand, hands at her sides, shoulders squared. She met his eyes briefly, then looked forward again. Respectful, neutral, safe. He didn't speak right away. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but deliberate. A pause meant to assert presence, authority, expectation. Finally, he leaned back slightly in his chair. "Well," he said at last, "that's what we're going to talk about." The door closed behind her with a quiet click, and somewhere outside, unseen and unheard, the last moments of an ordinary morning slipped away.
There was a kind of balance she'd learned to maintain long before she understood why it mattered. It wasn't written anywhere. No teacher ever explained it. No rule book ever mentioned it. But it governed everything. How loudly you laughed, how quickly you spoke, how confidently you carried yourself in certain spaces. Too little and you were invisible. Too much and you were a problem. She had learned where the line was. At home, her world felt different, quieter but warmer. The walls carried photographs instead of warnings, family gatherings, small celebrations, moments of pride captured and framed. Her mother believed in preparation, not fear, in dignity, not defiance. "People will try to tell you who you are," she used to say. "Don't make it easier for them." Those words stayed with her. Her mornings began early, usually before the sun fully rose. Breakfast wasn't rushed. There was time for small rituals, straightening her backpack straps, tying her shoes just right, smoothing out wrinkles that didn't really need smoothing. None of it was about perfection. It was about control. Control with safety. At school, that control became a kind of armor. She spoke when called on, never over others. She followed instructions exactly as given. She didn't challenge authority even when something felt wrong, especially then. She had seen what happened to students who did. There were moments, small ones, that most people never noticed. A teacher mispronouncing her name repeatedly but correcting everyone else's. A hand raised and overlooked again and again. A comment that was meant to be a joke but landed like a reminder. She didn't react. She adjusted. It wasn't submission, it was strategy. Because she knew something many of her classmates didn't have to think about, that mistakes were never judged equally, that discipline wasn't always about behavior, that perception mattered more than intent. And perception, she knew, was fragile. There were students who could be loud without being labeled disruptive, students who could question without being called disrespectful, students whose anger was interpreted as passion, whose mistakes were brushed off as immaturity. She watched, she learned, she stayed within the margins. Not because she lacked confidence, but because she understood consequences. Her teachers often described her the same way: well-behaved, quiet, responsible. Words that sounded like praise but carried an expectation underneath them. Don't change. She didn't mind at first. There was comfort in predictability, safety in being known for the right reasons. But over time, she began to notice something else. No matter how perfectly she followed the rules, she was never fully trusted. There was always an edge, a hesitation in certain glances, a sharper tone when she spoke too firmly, a readiness to correct her that didn't seem to apply to others. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. The principal embodied that feeling more than anyone else. She'd only seen him a handful of times before, at assemblies, in the hallway, standing with his arms crossed during school events. He was always composed, always confident, the kind of authority that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. And yet, whenever his eyes passed her, there was no warmth, no recognition, just evaluation, like she was a variable that needed to be managed. She once overheard him speaking to a teacher after an incident involving another student. His voice had been calm, measured, professional, but the words stayed with her. "We have to maintain order," he'd said. "Certain behaviors escalate if we don't address them early." He hadn't said names. He hadn't needed to. That was the thing about unspoken rules. They never required explanation. In the days leading up to that morning, nothing unusual had happened. No arguments, no disruptions, no warnings. She had followed her routine as always, unaware that she was already being watched through a lens she didn't control. When the staff member had called her out of class, her first instinct hadn't been fear, it had been calculation. She replayed every interaction in her head, searching for missteps. Had she spoken too firmly, asked too many questions, looked annoyed without realizing it? Nothing justified this, but justification, she knew, wasn't always necessary. As she stood in the principal's office now, she felt that invisible line pressing closer than ever before. The balance she worked so hard to maintain suddenly felt fragile, like it could tilt with a single misunderstood word. She answered his questions carefully, short sentences, no defensiveness, no emotion that could be misread. "Yes, sir. No, sir. I don't recall that, sir." Each response felt like walking across thin ice, slow, deliberate, measured. The principal listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. His expression never changed. That made it harder to read what he was thinking, or if he was listening at all. There was no evidence presented, no specific accusation, just a growing sense that something had already been decided. She felt it in the way he leaned forward slightly, hands clasped, in the way his questions shifted from factual to interpretive. "Do you think that was appropriate? How do you think that came across? Do you understand how that could be perceived?" Perception again. She did understand, more than he realized. What she didn't understand was why she was being asked to account for something that hadn't happened, or why her answers seemed to make no difference. The conversation ended without resolution. She was dismissed with a warning that felt intentionally vague, a reminder about expectations, a suggestion to be more mindful. Mindful of what, exactly, was never stated. As she walked back down the hallway, the weight of it settled in. This wasn't about behavior. It was about assumption. The line she'd spent years respecting had moved, quietly, without warning, and she was being blamed for crossing it. She returned to class with her composure intact, but something inside her had shifted, a realization she couldn't unsee.
No matter how careful she was, there would always be eyes waiting for her to slip. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface of the school's calm routines and polite smiles, a decision had already been made about who she was allowed to be. She didn't know yet how far that decision would go, but she could feel it tightening. And this time, staying quiet wouldn't be enough.
The second time she was called to the office, there was no knock. The intercom crackled briefly, her name spoken flatly, without context. No explanation followed, just an instruction disguised as routine. Please report to the principal's office. The room went still in that subtle way classrooms do when attention shifts all at once. A few students glanced up from their desks, others pretended not to notice. The teacher avoided her eyes entirely. She gathered her things again, slower this time, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something now that she hadn't that morning. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was momentum. The walk down the hallway felt different the second time. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. She noticed details she hadn't before, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the way her footsteps echoed just a little too loudly, the way a passing teacher paused for half a second too long before looking away. When she reached the office, the door was already open. The principal didn't ask her to sit. He stood behind his desk, arms crossed, posture rigid. Whatever patience he had performed earlier was gone now. In its place was something sharper, a confidence rooted in the certainty that nothing he said here would be questioned. He began speaking before she fully stepped inside. "We've had additional concerns brought to our attention," he said. No names, no sources, just authority speaking into the space. She stood where she was, hands clasped loosely in front of her, eyes forward. Her heart beat steadily, not racing, not slowing. She focused on her breathing, the way she had been taught. "Concerns about your attitude," he continued, "about the way you interact with staff." She frowned slightly, just enough to register confusion without challenging him. "I'm not sure I understand, sir." Her voice was calm, respectful, exactly what was expected. The principal stepped around the desk slowly, deliberately. Each step felt calculated, a physical reminder of the imbalance between them. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the faint trace of coffee on his breath. "That's part of the problem," he said. "You don't seem to understand how you come across." There it was again, not what you did, but how it looked. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped herself. She chose her words carefully. "I try to be respectful at all times, sir." He smiled, briefly, not with warmth, with something closer to amusement. "Intent doesn't erase impact," he said, "and we have to consider patterns." Patterns. She had heard that word used before, always vaguely, always without evidence, a way to turn isolated moments into narratives. "What pattern?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air. The principal's expression hardened. His smile disappeared. "This," he said, gesturing toward her, "this tone, this defensiveness." Defensive, for asking a question. Her chest tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. The trap was clear now. Silence could be interpreted as guilt. Speaking could be framed as attitude. There was no correct response. He turned and walked back behind his desk, sitting down with exaggerated calm. He folded his hands together, eyes fixed on her. "You need to understand something. We run a tight ship here. Order matters. Respect matters." "I understand," she replied. He leaned forward slightly. "Do you?" he asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you're testing boundaries." Testing boundaries. She thought of all the times she had stayed quiet, all the moments she had let slide, all the effort she had put into not standing out.
If this was testing boundaries, then the boundaries were never where she was told they were. The conversation shifted then, subtly but unmistakably. The principal's questions became statements, his assumptions hardened into conclusions. Every attempt she made to clarify only seemed to reinforce his narrative. He spoke about attitude problems, about lack of accountability, about how students like you often struggled with authority. Students like you. The phrase landed heavily, even though he didn't explain what it meant. He didn't have to. She felt the room closing in, not physically, but psychologically. The walls weren't moving, but the space for her to exist within them was shrinking. And still, she didn't raise her voice, she didn't cry, she didn't argue. She stood there, absorbing the weight of every word, because she understood something the principal either didn't realize or didn't care about. He wasn't trying to resolve a problem, he was asserting dominance. The door to the office opened part way then, and a secretary peeked inside. The principal waved her away without looking. "Close the door," he said. The click of its shutting sounded louder than it should have. "Let me be very clear. If this behavior continues, there will be consequences." "What behavior?" she asked softly. His jaw tightened. "This," he snapped. "This questioning, this resistance." Resistance. She nodded once slowly. "I hear you," she said. The words tasted bitter, but she meant them. She did hear him, clearly, completely. What she didn't hear was fairness or curiosity or a desire to understand. The principal straightened in his chair, apparently satisfied. "Good," he said, "because we won't have this conversation again." He dismissed her with a gesture, not even bothering to look up as she turned toward the door. As she stepped back into the hallway, her hands were trembling, just slightly. She clenched them into fists, then relaxed them again. She refused to let anyone see. She walked back toward her classroom with the same measured pace she always used, even as something inside her fractured quietly. Power, she realized, didn't need to be loud. It didn't need proof. It didn't need witnesses. It only needed confidence that it would never be challenged. The principal returned to his paperwork, convinced the issue had been handled, that his authority had been reaffirmed, that the system had worked as intended. He had no idea that his certainty was about to collide with something far beyond his control, and she, walking back through the halls that never felt so narrow, understood one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't over. It was just getting started.
The third time she was called to the office, it wasn't quiet. It happened in the middle of the day, when the hallways were loud and full, when teachers were switching classes and students lingered in clusters, laughing, talking, existing without thinking twice about it. The announcement came over the intercom, her name echoing through the room in a way that felt exposed. This time, there was no attempt at discretion. A few students turned in their seats. Someone whispered her name. The teacher paused, then nodded toward the door without meeting her eyes. She stood up slowly. Her chest felt tight now, not with fear, but with something heavier. A sense that whatever was waiting for her wasn't about understanding anymore. It was about display. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed the difference immediately. 2 staff members were waiting, not just one. Their faces were neutral, but their presence said everything. This was official. They walked her down the corridor together, one in front, one behind, not escorting her physically, not yet, but close enough to make a point. Students moved out of the way as they passed, conversations quieted, eyes followed. She kept her head level, her pace steady. She refused to rush. By the time they reached the office, her name had already spread ahead of her. The door was open. Inside, the principal stood again, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 teachers were seated near the wall. The secretary sat at her desk, hands folded, eyes carefully averted. An audience. The principal didn't offer her a seat. Instead, he gestured toward the center of the room. "Stand there," he said. The tone wasn't angry. It was controlled, clinical, the kind of voice people used when they believed they were being reasonable. She did as she was told. "This has gone far enough," he began, his voice carrying easily. "We've received multiple reports about your conduct today." Reports, plural. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't interrupt. "You've been disrespectful," he continued, dismissive, confrontational. Each word landed like a label being stamped into place. "I haven't," she started, then stopped herself. The principal raised a hand. "This is not a discussion. This is an explanation." Explanation, not inquiry. He turned slightly, addressing the room as much as he was addressing her. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a respectful environment," he said, "but that requires cooperation, and frankly, your behavior has been disruptive." Disruptive. She looked around the room, at the teachers who wouldn't meet her gaze, at the secretary whose jaw was clenched, at the principal who now seemed entirely comfortable in this role. Her role was clear too. She wasn't a student anymore. She was a problem. "What exactly did I do?" she asked quietly. The room went still. The principal's eyes narrowed, just a fraction. "There it is," he said, "that tone." Tone, not words, not actions, tone. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, not to spare her feelings, but to sharpen the moment. "You've been challenging authority," he said, rolling your eyes, questioning instructions, acting like rules don't apply to you. None of it was true, but truth had already lost its place in the room. She felt heat rise to her face, not embarrassment, but restraint, the effort of holding everything in. She clasped her hands together to stop them from shaking. "I didn't roll my eyes, and I followed every instruction I was given." Her voice was still calm, measured, but now it carried something else too, resolve. The principal laughed softly. "See," he said to the others, "always an answer, always an excuse." An excuse. He turned back to her, his expression hardening. "Let me be very clear. This attitude is unacceptable, and if you can't correct it, we will take disciplinary action." "What attitude?" she asked. The question wasn't defiant, it was honest. That's what made it dangerous. The principal's face flushed slightly. "Enough," he snapped. "You don't get to play innocent here." Play innocent. The implication hung heavy in the air. He reached for a file on his desk, thin but symbolic. He opened it slowly, deliberately, as if to show her that documentation existed, whether it reflected reality or not. "This goes on your record, and if I hear one more complaint, we'll escalate." Her throat tightened. This was no longer about the present moment. This was about her future. A mark, a narrative, a version of her that could follow her long after she left this building. She looked around the room again, searching for something, fairness, hesitation, doubt. She found none. The principal straightened, his voice rising just enough to be heard outside the office. "Do you understand me?" he asked. Every instinct in her body screamed to speak, to defend herself, to name the injustice unfolding in real time. But she knew what that would cost. "Yes, sir," she said. The words felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of herself. He nodded, satisfied. "Good," he said, "because I expect better from you." From you, not from students, not from everyone, from her. The dismissal was abrupt, a wave of the hand, a clear signal that she was no longer worth the time. As she turned to leave, she heard it, a final remark tossed casually into the room. "Some people just don't know their place," the principal said. The words hit harder than anything else he'd said. She stopped for a moment, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then she continued walking, out of the office, past the waiting area,
down the hallway where students stared openly now, curiosity mixed with something else, speculation, judgment. She felt exposed, stripped of context, reduced to rumor. By the time she reached the bathroom at the end of the hall, her composure finally cracked. She locked herself into a stall and leaned her forehead against the cool metal door. Her hands trembled now, uncontrollably. Tears burned behind her eyes, not spilling, not yet, held back by sheer will. She didn't cry because she was weak. She cried because she understood exactly what had just happened. She had been humiliated, not by accident, not through misunderstanding, but intentionally, made small, put on display, warned without cause, and everyone had watched. When she finally stepped back out, she washed her face carefully, taking her time. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, eyes red, expression composed, spine straight. They had tried to break her quietly. They had failed. She returned to class, but nothing felt the same. The room buzzed with energy she didn't share. The lesson drifted past her like noise. Her mind was somewhere else now, no longer searching for ways to stay invisible. Something had shifted. Because humiliation, she realized, was meant to end the story, to teach silence, to enforce obedience, but it had done the opposite. As the afternoon wore on and the sun dipped lower, she made a decision, not loud, not dramatic, but firm. She would not fight this the way they expected. She would not raise her voice. She would not make a scene. She would make a call. And the people who believed they held all the power had no idea what was already in motion.
She waited until the last bell rang, not because she had to, but because timing mattered. The halls emptied in waves, lockers slamming shut, voices rising with the relief of freedom. Students poured outside, backpacks slung low, laughter spilling into the open air. Teachers retreated to their lounges. The school exhaled. Only then did she move. She walked with purpose now, not rushing, not hesitating. The humiliation from earlier still sat heavy in her chest, but it had changed shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It had hardened into something steady. Resolve. She stepped outside and paused beneath the wide oak tree near the parking lot. Its branches stretched overhead, offering shade and a kind of quiet protection. This was where she always waited when she needed to think. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. For a moment, she simply held it there, not shaking, not unsure, just aware of the weight of what she was about to do. She didn't call friends. She didn't post online. She didn't ask for sympathy. She scrolled to one contact, a name she'd memorized long before she ever needed it. Her finger hovered, then pressed. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, calm, steady, unmistakably familiar. Yes? She took a breath. "It's me," she said. There was a pause, not of confusion, but of focus. The kind that meant full attention had been given. "What happened?" the voice asked. She didn't rush to explain. She didn't exaggerate. She spoke carefully, recounting events exactly as they'd unfolded. The accusations, the tone, the humiliation, the words that couldn't be taken back. She left nothing out. She added nothing extra. On the other end of the line, the voice remained calm. No interruptions, no anger yet, just listening. When she finished, there was silence again, deeper this time. Finally, the voice spoke. "Are you safe right now?" "Yes," she said. "I'm home soon." "Good. Then you did the right thing calling." That was all. No promises, no reassurance, just certainty. She ended the call and stood there for a moment longer, staring out across the parking lot as the last cars pulled away. The school looked harmless now, ordinary, almost peaceful. If only walls could remember what happened inside them.
At home, nothing felt different at first. Shoes by the door, the quiet hum of appliances, the comfort of familiar space. Her mother noticed the change immediately, though, the way her shoulders were set, the way her answers came slower. They talked, not loudly, not dramatically, just honestly. There were no raised voices, no tears, only a shared understanding that something serious had crossed a line. That evening passed quietly. Dinner, homework, the rhythm of normalcy resumed, but it felt temporary, like a calm sea before something unseen shifted beneath it. She went to bed early. Her sleep didn't come easily. Her mind replayed moments over and over, the principal's voice, the laughter, the silence of the others in the room. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone with those memories. Someone else knew now, and that changed everything. The next morning at school began like any other. Teachers greeted students, bells rang, announcements droned on about upcoming events. The principal's voice even crackled over the intercom, smooth and confident as ever. No one mentioned the day before. The principal walked the halls with his usual posture, exchanging pleasantries, nodding at staff. He moved like a man who believed the matter was closed. He had delivered his warning. He had asserted control. He had done what the system had always allowed him to do. What he didn't know was restraint had been mistaken for weakness. Behind the scenes, conversations were happening, not emotional ones, not impulsive ones, but deliberate, disciplined discussions. There were questions being asked that didn't rely on his interpretation. There were names being noted that carried weight beyond the school district. By midday, the sky outside had darkened slightly, clouds rolling in without warning. The air felt heavier, charged. Students noticed first, a low rumble in the distance, not thunder, something else, something mechanical. A few heads turned toward the windows. Then the sound grew louder. Engines, multiple. The principal heard it too, faintly at first, then unmistakably. He paused mid-sentence in a meeting, frowning. "What is that?" someone asked. No one answered. The sound intensified, drawing closer now, impossible to ignore. Teachers stepped into the hall, students crowded the windows, whispers spreading like electricity. And then they saw them. Vehicles turning into the school's long driveway, not one, not two, but several, uniformed, precise, moving with unmistakable coordination. A convoy. Not police, not district officials, something else entirely. The principal stepped outside, confusion etched across his face. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't scheduled. This wasn't supposed to happen. The vehicle slowed, then stopped. Doors opened. And in that moment, standing on the steps of the building he believed he controlled, he felt it, for the first time. Uncertainty. Because authority, he was about to learn, only worked in silence. And silence had finally been broken.
The sound of the engines didn't fade when the vehicle stopped. They idled, low, steady, deliberate, like a presence that refused to be ignored. Students pressed closer to the windows now, their earlier whispers dissolving into stunned quiet. Teachers stood frozen in doorways, unsure whether to intervene or step back. Phones appeared in hands, though no one seemed brave enough to raise them yet. This was unfamiliar territory. The principal descended the front steps slowly, his confident stride replaced by something more cautious. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his posture, and forced a polite expression onto his face, the same one he used at district meetings and public events. Control through composure. The lead vehicle's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a formal military uniform that carried weight without decoration. His movements were precise, economical, There was no rush, no spectacle, just intention. Then another followed, and another. They formed a loose line near the base of the steps, not blocking entrances, not raising voices. They didn't need to. Their presence spoke for them. The principal cleared his throat. "Can I help you?" he asked, projecting authority he no longer felt. The man at the center of the group looked at him, not with hostility, not with curiosity, but with calm recognition. "Yes," he said, evenly, "you can." The principal blinked, momentarily thrown by the lack of explanation. "We're here regarding a formal concern," the man continued, "and we'd prefer to discuss it inside." Inside. The word carried an unexpected weight. The principal hesitated for just a second too long. It was barely noticeable, but enough. Enough for the teachers watching to exchange glances. Enough for the students to feel the shift. "Of course," the principal said finally, "if you'll follow me." He turned and led them back into the building. The hallways had never been this quiet. Students stood pressed against lockers, eyes wide, breathing shallow. Teachers ushered classes back into rooms without explanation. The normal rhythm of the school collapsed into a held breath. As the group passed, conversations stopped entirely. They entered the office, the same space where humiliation had been delivered so casually the day before. Now the room felt smaller. The principal gestured toward the chairs. "Please," he said. The man in uniform didn't sit immediately. He looked around the room, taking in every detail, the framed certificates, the orderly desk, the thin file resting near the corner. "Before we sit, I want to be clear about why we're here." The principal nodded, swallowing. "We've received a report concerning a student under your authority, a report involving verbal misconduct, misuse of disciplinary power, and discriminatory behavior." The words landed cleanly, precisely, without emotion. The principal stiffened. "I assure you, we take student welfare very seriously. Any actions taken were within school policy." The man nodded slowly. "I'm sure that's what you believe." Belief, not fact. He finally sat, folding his hands neatly in front of him. The others followed. Their posture was relaxed but alert, the posture of people accustomed to command, not control. "Let's talk about the incident, in detail." The principal began explaining, his version of events delivered smoothly, professionally. He spoke about concerns, patterns, tone, about maintaining order, about respect. As he spoke, the man listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When the principal finished, the room fell silent. "Thank you," said the man. "Now I'd like to ask a few questions." He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse, he asked. "What specific behavior violated policy? What documentation supports this? Who witnessed these alleged actions?" Each question was calm, methodical. The principal answered at first with confidence, then with hesitation, then with visible strain. His explanations grew less certain as details were requested. Names, times, evidence. At one point, he reached for the file on his desk. The man raised a hand gently. "We've already reviewed that," he said. The principal froze. "You reviewed it?" he asked. "Yes," the man replied, "along with statements from staff and audio." Audio. The word echoed. The principal's face drained of color. "We're also aware of comments made following the disciplinary action, specifically remarks regarding the student's place." The room felt suddenly airless. "That was taken out of context," the principal said quickly. "I didn't mean—" The man held up a hand again. "Intent," he said calmly, "does not erase impact." The words landed with quiet finality. The principal recognized them. He had used them himself. Silence stretched. Then the man leaned forward slightly. "Let me explain something," he said.
In my profession, authority comes with responsibility. When that responsibility is abused, accountability is not optional." The principal's voice faltered. "This is a school matter. I don't understand why—" "Because the student in question," the man interrupted gently, "is under the guardianship of someone who understands systems, someone trained to recognize misuse of power, and someone who will not ignore it." The principal said nothing. The man stood. "This matter will be escalated beyond this building, effective immediately." He slid a document across the desk. "Administrative leave, pending investigation." The principal stared at the paper, his hands unmoving. Outside, the school remained silent. Inside, something irreversible had happened. Authority met accountability, and for the first time, the power imbalance had shifted, not through shouting, not through chaos, but through presence, precision, and refusal to look away. As the man in uniform stood to leave, the principal remained seated, smaller somehow, his certainty fractured. The convoy would depart soon, but the echo of their arrival would remain. And somewhere down the hallway, a girl sat quietly at her desk, unaware of every detail, but already feeling the weight lift. Justice, she would learn, didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived in measured steps, and everything changed.
By the end of the day, the school felt unfamiliar. Not louder, not chaotic, just altered. The bell rang, but students didn't rush out the way they usually did. Conversations stayed low, uncertain. Teachers exchanged looks in the hallways, the kind that said something important had happened, even if no one was saying it out loud. The building still stood, the routines still existed, but something beneath them had shifted. She noticed it first in the smallest ways. A teacher met her eyes and nodded, not out of obligation, but recognition. Another asked if she was doing okay, quietly, without drawing attention. Even the hallways felt different, as if the walls themselves had loosened their grip. No announcements were made, no apologies delivered publicly. Systems rarely acknowledge their own fractures, but absence spoke loudly. The principal's office door stayed closed. The nameplate still hung there, but the space behind it was empty. Authority, once so absolute, now felt conditional, fragile. She sat in class, listening to the low hum of a lecture, her notebook open in front of her. For the first time in days, her shoulders relaxed. Not completely, not yet, but enough to breathe. She hadn't come back to school seeking victory. She didn't feel triumphant. What she felt was quieter, steadier. Relief. Not because someone had been punished, but because the story had changed. She was no longer alone in it. At home that evening, the conversation was brief. No replaying every detail, no celebration. Just a shared understanding that the right line had been drawn and held. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," her mother said softly. "You spoke the truth, and you stayed yourself." That mattered more than any outcome, because what lingered after the convoy left wasn't fear, it was awareness. Teachers became more careful with their words. Meetings felt different. The unspoken rules, the ones that had always existed, were suddenly visible. Not erased, but exposed. And exposure changed how they worked. She noticed how often authority relied on silence, how easily narratives were shaped when no one questioned them, how quickly confidence collapsed when accountability entered the room. She also noticed something else. Her own voice felt steadier now. Not louder, not defiant, just grounded. She raised her hand in class again, asked questions, expressed uncertainty when she didn't understand something, not to challenge, but to exist fully, without apology. No one stopped her.
And that, more than anything, stayed with her. The humiliation that was meant to define her became something else entirely, a turning point, a moment that revealed how power behaved when it thought it was unobserved, and how quickly it retreated when it was. The school would move on, institutions always did. New routines would settle in, new leaders would take their places. From the outside, everything would look the same. But for those who had witnessed it, truly witnessed it, nothing was unchanged. Some lessons don't announce themselves. They settle quietly, reshaping what feels possible. She understood now that dignity wasn't about silence. It wasn't about shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. It was about knowing when to stand still and when to speak without losing yourself in either. And somewhere beyond the school walls, engines that had once idled with purpose returned to their ordinary paths. They didn't linger. They didn't need to. Their message had already landed. Power was never the loudest voice in the room. It was the one willing to answer for itself. As she walked home that afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She moved at an easy pace, backpack resting against her shoulders, steps unhurried. The world felt wider, not because it had become fair overnight, but because she had seen proof, real proof, that unfairness could be confronted without becoming it. That truth stayed with her, and it would stay long after the memory of a principal's office faded, because what remained wasn't fear. What remained was clarity. And once you have that, silence is no longer the only option.